So my name is Grzymala-Busse. I'm the director of the Europe Center. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome back Isabela Mares, who used to teach here at Stanford and is now the Arnold Wolfers Professor of Political Science at Yale University. She's an expert on several areas of political development, including democratization, clientelism and corruption, taxation and fiscal capacity development, and social policy reforms. She's the author of 5 books on early electoral reforms, post-communist clientelism, late capitalist economic policy, and the role of business in the development of the welfare state. So we are absolutely delighted to welcome her here, and she will speak today on a talk based on 2 different papers entitled Parliaments in Times of Democratic Growth.
This is an ongoing project, but at the very late, I really want some comments and suggestions where to take it. And so the motivating questions for this program. So right, I mean, in a way, the simplest motivating question is how to talk when there's provocation. I mean, populist extremist parties are about provoking, are about breaking laws. And so what is the optimal response? I mean, how should one engage this type of rhetoric and action and sort of right and kind of, you know, in the way that sort of right this process that I'm sort of right describing, this process of sort of parliamentary erosion is about results from the sort of right from in a way the failure of mainstream parties to actually sort of right find a strategy. And in a way, what I'm trying to describe today is sort of right a variety of strategies that have been tried in different contexts and sort of right and try to reflect on you know what happened. So that is kind of in a way the type of questions where I'm inviting your kind of conversation. I'm thinking in a way we don't have this, although so this is not such a new process. Okay, so stepping back from this question and sort of how to break this down and sort of what parliaments, right? There's sort of right. There's a lot of things that are happening. In particular, this question of parliamentary norms is hard to understand. How do we even study this? It's just so much tools, so much interruptions. So sort of right. So what exactly? Sort of how could we break this down analytically? How can we study parliamentary norms and their erosion? And then the sort of right the question about sort of right the mainstream party strategies, right? Sort of right how can they respond? So as we know from Vince and Stepan, parliamentary erosion is the first step of democratic erosion. This is where it's starting. Yet, if you think about it, we don't have a sort of a good account of what happens. So right in these parliaments, in the sort of right at the process of which sort of right they are in a way eroding, so to speak. So sort of right. So what is sort of right? How should one think of the dynamic? Kind of you know sort of right. How does parliamentary erosion unfold? If you think about sort of right the current literature and the step it's taking, sort of parliament a little bit is to my sort of surprise when I sort of started to look into it over understudied. We have a literature on executives and executive aggrandizement. That's sort of right, you know, still the standard in a way, and sort of right the elite level approach to erosion. We have, and this is sort of right, I think kind of an intermediate step, which is sort of looking at party strategies. And so I'm editing this this volume in the comparative political studies with Giovanni Capoccia on this issue on party strategies. They can be in the electoral arena, they don't have to be necessarily in the parliamentary arena, but sort of right understanding kind of sort of like the mix of strategies. This may be building kind of on the work of Giovanni Capoccia on sort of right the party bans, but then again, that is only one strategy. There's a mix of other things that can influence right, and sort of right. So the party ban is only one, but sort of right, but how do you choose in that mix? And then sort of right, everyone, you know, wants to study this goes to the voters. Sort of right, great sort of right, beginning of sort of right trying to understand sort of right voters, the voters kind of are new on the place. So I do really think kind of the parliamentary arena gives us like an immense kind of opportunity, right? It's not just an endless one, such as in the erosion literature. There's a range of actors, right, and sort of right, and the heterogeneity of strategies, and that's and that should be okay, sort of explored. So what do I mean by anti-parliamentarism? Right, I mean sort of like the strategy of mainstream parties, historically or today. And the goal is basically you come to parliament with a goal to undermine it. And here let me give you 2 quotes, I mean just to motivate the sort of historical part of the project. One is sort of like from the Communist Party Congress, so think about here, that kind of communists came to parliament with a goal to undermine parliament, right? They did not believe in kind of parliamentary work. And sort of the party Congress in 24 stated explicitly the goal of the parliamentary participation is to engage in agitation in order to undermine the bourgeois state. We're not carrying out parliamentary work, but only relentlessly fight against other parties, right? So the explicit strategy was sort of like disruption. Thank you for coming, with the goal of undermining it. And the same sort of right on the right, I'm going to come to this sort of later because sort of right, I'm going to look at the far right parties entered parliament much later. But here's an entry from Goebbels' diary, 26, the first time he entered parliament. The plenary session, a school of angry Jews, parliamentarism has long been ready for its downfall. We will sign the death knell for it. I had already enough of this comment. So this is historically, but sort of right, but we see in a way the similar kind of reaction in the kind of contemporary sort of right parliaments. And let me just give you again sort of right some statements of mainstream politicians that are sort of right motivated. So for example, like in the kind of the current Bundestag, which is sort of right, I'm going to be showing you a lot of data today about sort of right what's happening today in the contemporary Bundestag as a result of the progress of the far-right party. What we experience is a termination of everything of that is parliamentary normal institution. You have pulled off the mask from your face, and what we receive the grimace of non-democracy. First comes provocation, war breaking the taboo, breaking democracy. So that is sort of the view, that is the perception of importance about sort of this change in norms. And same sort of right on the center left, Susanne Guttrich from the SPD declared war, and I said we have accepted the war of Democrats against non-Democrats. We will fight against those who attempt to destroy parliamentary democracy from within. So you see the parallels, right? Okay, so right between the context. I'll skip Marine Le Pen, but just the sort of right, the final point motivating here is Marco Buschmann, again, sort of right, center right, so sort of FDP, current German minister of sort of right of justice. You know, physical obstruction is intended to keep the parliamentarians themselves from doing their work, to noise, to violence, and through a climate of threat. Okay, so the rest of the parallels, the sort of right, the reference to Weimar is everywhere. It is everywhere in the German media, which kind of is asking this question kind of constantly, and this is sort of how I was getting interested in this. And so right, kind of, are we reaching at the current point in time a Weimar level, sort of erosion? And so sort of how can we even sort of kind of characterize it? I'm sorry, what would be the level, what would be the data that would allow us to engage at kind of in these sort of right comparisons over time, right? And this is sort of right the statement, sort of right, this was at the time of COVID with a lot of disruption that sort of right, that we have reached. So I'm sort of as a part of what the project does is kind of coming together, so we're trying to pick up sort of that data and different empirical strategies that allow us to sort of understand the erosion and sort of right. And one of this data, and I will come back to this when I will describe sort of right this sort of right, the Weimar part of the project is sort of actually the kind of the calls to order, right? The sanctions that sort of right at the head of the sort of right of the parliament used against these extremists that were described. Okay, initially it was kind of communist. I mean, sort of right. I mean, the sort of right the far right enters much later because sort of right and kind of they were banned. And sort of right there was this sort of right ban against kind of the far right parties, and they were not convinced whether they should ban it. But as you see, sort of right in this sort of right chart here, which I will sort of right analyze, there is sort of right an increase over time in this kind of disruption. And we think, sort of right, I mean, a part of the project is sort of right authored by the data scientists, that sort of right that we have a lot of other data, sort of right informal interruptions that is kind of, that is recorded now sort of right in parliaments, not just in Germany, but everywhere, that sort of allows us maybe to get at this question. And I will sort of right defend this data in a minute. I'm kind of say, well, I'm shouts and laughter. This is sort of right how parliaments work at all points and times. What is this? It is interesting because kind of the Bundestag itself, sort of right, the parliament kind of, sort of right singles out these behaviors as a sort of a separate category because kind of they violate the norms of order. They violate the Geschäftsordnung, the rules, sort of right. So there are some informal and sort of right, and I think kind of the goal is to piece apart and see sort of right which of these sort of right behaviors kind of, can be sort of right understood as a violation of norms. But in sort of, as you will see, this is not just something that the extremists do, and this is sort of right what I'm the point that I'm trying to make. This is something that is co-produced by now by the members of the sort of right center party, center left, and center right, and sort of right. And this gives us the opportunity to understand their sort of their incentives and their responses. So I'm going to sort of right focus a little bit more on the mainstream parties, okay? Kind of, I mean, the extremists, as I've just told you, I mean, their role is to provoke, their role is to undermine. But what is the sort of right optimal response? And what can they do sort of right again when they're faced with an actor that is there like just to constantly what's the incentives, the variation across parties, and what are the incentives of legislators? And I'm just going to draw on 3 papers. One is forthcoming in this volume, this CPS volume I mentioned that I'm editing with Giovanni on and it's more conceptual on the typology of the strategies. And then just going to give you the framework. But then sort of right, I'm going to use both these cases in the Weimar period and the contemporary period in Spittel with Young to sort of right to get at this kind of variation in the sort of right strategies of responses. So this first papers, okay, first of all, tries to understand sort of right again the menu of strategies. So what can you do? Okay, as a mainstream politician, sort of right faced with disruption, faced with sort of right extremist parties that can break norms. And I think we can kind of think of sort of 2 dimensions of variation. We can think about sort of right things that you can do in parliament, right? Okay, sort of right, and kind of things that you can do on the floor of the chambers. And the things that you can do sort of in a way, changing things, changing the entry of politicians, changing sort of rules that you can change that sort of right that affect the ability of the sort of right, I mean kind of these extremist kind of politicians to act. And just to say that sort of right in the paper, I'm mapping out all these things were considered in these kind of 2 cases, 2 very important cases, the Republic. There's quite interesting kind of variation in the sort of right in the strategies. So these are, so you can think about these are collective sort of right strategies. You can change the procedures of the chambers, you can change the electoral law, you can kind of replace proportional representation with majoritarian systems in the whole control and kind of was in parliament, was extremely disruptive. And so right, you could make kind of a decision to make immunity much narrower and take away the immunity. So when do you how do you choose among them? And I think kind of the so just to go over some examples, just to see sort of right that the menu is very broad. Electoral reform was sort of right on the agenda. It is always on the agenda when you have extreme. There's always this kind of reconsideration. Okay, so right, is PR really effective? Is PR helping us kind of sort of right in this context? And sort of right, and it's quite interesting. And sort of, I mean, I'm happy Jonathan is here. Maybe he sort of, I'm curious, right? That our literature doesn't reflect much on this, or sort of right on the kind of the move away from PR when you sort of have extremist parties. With the idea being that kind of sort of right. I mean that in a sort of right PR system you can kind of hide demagogues on the list, and so as a result, kind of this is actually permissive. And so sort of right and standard parties in Germany, kind of, the sort of right, I mean, the DDP, the sort of right, the Democrats, and that's been really understood and pushed. And so there's this flurry of proposals to move away from PR, to reintroduce majoritarian elections just to kind of, sort of right, to limit the variability. And these proposals failed because kind of the left was not interested in this, right? The SPD took a very hard line. This was sort of still a large party, and they sort of blocked this historically. Whereas again, and this is not the paper that I'm presenting here, but this is sort of right, this already published paper, but in France, kind of, sort of right, and kind of they understood much earlier, and the socialists shifted, right? And sort of right, and just to stop the entry of communists, they reintroduced majoritarian elections in 27. Okay, so electoral reform may be something. So the question is, why does it succeed in some cases and not in others? You can change the parliamentary rules. Okay, sort of right. I mean, kind of there's a variety of things that are on the table, and then that's something that I'm examining. You can limit frivolous amendments. Okay, sort of right. You can strengthen the role of the parties to allocate speaking time, to limit sort of right the ability of extremists and so forth. Both the Republic France and Weimar Germany moved this, but very, very late. Okay, and sort of right for Germany, it's too late to stop this. The sort of right the disruption. Okay, and you can kind of change away the immunity. Okay, so you can change the immunity. Again, that's an individual strategy. You can take away the immunity of the extremists. But again, we see sort of right reluctance to use this. This is sort of right data that I've collected in the parliament, you see there's a lot of sort of right immunity kind of cases on the agenda of the parliament. There's a lot of discussion to sort of right, to restrict immunity. And for many years, sort of these proposals do not go forward because kind of centrist parties are reluctant to use this kind of tool. And they only sort of right turn to this much late after 1930, okay, much late, and that is sort of right something that may kind of also again be a missed opportunity. Okay, so in the face of this, what is happening in the and now I'm kind of coming to the paper, in the face that sort of right these other more collective strategies, there's sort of very hard to build a consensus around this. Some parties consider them costly and others. So they end up really relying on this one instrument, okay, sort of right in the Weimar Parliament, which is the call to order. Okay, so there's sort of right, this changes the PR system breaks down. Okay, the PR system is not adopted, and sort of right, the procedure is adopted very late. Restrictions and immunity, okay, again, very timidly. Again, contrast between France and Germany. In France, the sort of right, they take away the immunity of all the communists without a problem. There's not the, so right, so we end up, okay, sort of right, for a variety of reasons with the sort of right, with the reliance on this one tool, the individual targeting, and that is sort of right the strategy that the German left wants, and that is sort of right. And I want to sort of right now look into the data and then try to understand this, but I'm sort of right and try to argue that this was, in addition to the fact that sort of right it was sort of right ineffective, but it also then created opportunities for counter-organization. You went after that, and then sort of as a result, kind of just the tumult escalated because kind of center party politicians that had sort of an incentive to kind of to counter. So this is sort of like what I call sort of like in a way the spiral of erosion. Okay, as I mentioned before, so if we try to understand sort of who are the extremists and sort of how important are they, these are sort of like the 5 parliaments of the Weimar period. And sort of right, if you see sort of right communists, I mean sort of right entering kind of parliament with this sort of right very disruptive in a way sort of right agenda, sort of right our presence throughout the period, right? I mean sort of right a faction that is growing in time. But as I mentioned before, the far right parties sort of are much weaker. Okay, sort of right. I mean the Völkische and the NSDAP, and only sort of right after sort of right 1930, this is sort of right the turning point when kind of sort of right and kind of 107. Sort of right from the sort of right far right. So again, sort of right, the preferred strategy appeared to be sort of right. We're going to call them to order. Okay, so how are they doing this? Well, they're using the kind of the existing procedures of the parliament that sort of right that allows the president, okay, to call speaker to orders and then impose some kind of sanctions, on them if they are sort of right, if they're violating the norms. Okay, sort of right, asking them to leave. Okay, excluding them sort of right for a longer period of time if they sort of right if they perceive. Who's the enforcer of this? This is sort of right becomes the hero or the anti-hero of this paper. So this is Paul Löbe. He was sort of a SPD, a center, sort of right a social democratic kind of politician. He was the head because kind of the SPD had the largest fraction in parliament sort of throughout the time. Sort of he was kind of the head and sort of right, and he was viewed. Okay, as even by his opponents, as kind of as even him, as sort of right trying, okay, given sort of okay, the sort of the chaos that was around him, sort of right seen as sort of a master, even on the high waves of the raging parliamentary scene. This is someone from sort of right from the sort of right a centrist kind of Democrat, okay, who sort of still had a lot of praise to say. And even sort of right, I mean, the liberals, okay, praised him for his firm, energetic leadership, which made it possible, okay, to complete the difficult tasks. He tried to appease. He tried to sort of right to block this kind of disruption by sort of right by in a way by drawing on the sort of right in a way the informal the sort of right the parliamentary jurisdiction. That sort of right that had been kind of sort of right formed sort of right even during the imperial period. So what is a statement? What is a sort of right? What is a provocation? That kind of order, verbal violence against parliament, against the members of parliament, anti-Semitic slurs, and incitation to disorder and violence. And so, sort of right, so he was trying to enforce this. I don't think kind of, I do think this is a strategy. Of course, not every sort of right, he didn't call every disruption order. But as a result of this, we have sort of right this data set of sort of right of 1,500 cases, around 1,500 of cases that sort of right that result from sort of right his effort in a way to stall this provocation. And so right, and this is an effort in a way that's sort of right that I'm going to call demarcation, right? This is an effort to sort of right to reinforce then the norms and the rules, and to control the agenda, and to sort of right and to demarcate from opponents. And this sort of right in 1932, when kind of the NSDAP becomes the largest faction, and kind of Göring, you see him, becomes kind of the president, takes over this role, and then they stop reporting this. So this in a way, this is what constrains this data set that I just showed you, sort of right on provocation. So what do these do? Where does the SPD, where does Lede demarcate? So I'm looking at it's kind of these calls to orders by sort of right by issue areas. Okay, and then sort of right, and I'm looking sort of right across context, or right minority governments, or sort of polarized pluralism. Sartori's phrase, this refers to this kind of context where you had extremists on both the left and the right. Right, so that's sort of right the period after 1930, and so right, the interesting sort of right result that sort of right that kind of that you can see here is that it doesn't happen on sort of right on policy areas, right? It's not sort of a strategy that they sort of right, I mean, that they used to in a way to distinguish themselves sort of right from the kind of communists, I mean, for a long time, which were kind of competing kind of with the SPD on sort of right on policy issues, and were sort of right and kind of using kind of disruption just to challenge them. But it happens on sort of right on these kind of constitutional and legal issues, on sort of issues of legal reforms, the sort of right sort of right constitutional changes, sort of right party bans, sort of bans on the far right and so on. So it is a demarcation, okay, sort of right, that's more used on valence issues rather than on policy issues. And it is sort of right an effort, okay, sort of right to appeal to all voters, not just voters on the left, okay, and to sort of right to establish order. But this sort of right strategy is ineffective and fails because kind of sort of right, I mean, mainstream parties once kind of a call to order was instituted, mainstream parties kind of continued in a way sort of right, I mean, to amplify the sort of right the rhetoric, and they responded to this kind of call to order to sort of to a provocation, which then is sort of setting in motion this further process of eroding of parliamentary norms. So how do I identify counter provocation? Right, and this is sort of something that I'm sort of more interested in. This is sort of and one of the sort of right strategies is sort of right the one in a way a problematic one where you respond to the provoker, you respond to the extremist by counter provoking. So this has required hand coding. So I read all the sort of right, all the instances of sort of right the imposition of the calls to order, and then I sort of looked at sort of right if they are then sort of right followed by a kind of a counter response of the mainstream party that sort of right that escalates. So sort of right here's an example, right, on sort of right how this looks in the data. So sort of right, so the Nazis say, we make a proposal, transform the Puritan holiday to Germany's national holiday, then you will give the Republic the holiday that it deserves. A clear provocation, which is called to order. Because sort of what I called you, right? This is sort of right that the extremists provoke, sort of right that we kind of but then, the SPD interjects, you are a pitiful creature. That is the counter provocation, that is the escalation that sort of right, that is kind of brought in motion, and then sort of right, and then the further kind of escalates Jewish servants, Jewish bans. Okay, so this is sort of right in a way one of the dynamics of sort of right norm erosion that sort of we see in these parliaments, and I will kind of try to show you a little bit in the contemporary parliament. So these are sort of right, these are just the isolated instances of counter provocation that I have sort of right isolated with this sort of right, with this kind of, hand coding. And then sort of right, I mean, they are not, sort of right, I mean, following in a way the same sort of right patterns as the provocation, and they are sort of right, polarized rules, they're more sort of right, I mean, this counter provocation is concentrated in the last period, right, in the period when you had sort of right extremists on both sides. So this is sort of right where this kind of, this perverse dynamic whereby sort of right you respond to the provokers through counter provokers, and where sort of right the mainstream parties are the main kind of, sort of right are co-producers of the erosion sort of right happens. I mean, this is sort of like what I would take away from this. I have much more that I'm working on sort of like who is kind of attacked and sort of like the language and so on. So it's all parties. Okay, not just one single party. It's basically kind of a response all mainstream parties. So the tentative result is sort of like how do I read this data? How do I just try to think about this data? Is, well, what went wrong in this parliament? One is the dominant party chose individualized rather than collective strategies. Okay, and that's a contrast to other cases. Okay, sort of right, and that's maybe something to investigate why and under what conditions. Why is it that the more far-reaching changes sort of right were rejected, kind of, you know, sort of right in this case, right? So sort of right, so the bottom line here is that sort of right, I mean, going after the extremists with these individualized strategies is not sort of right, I mean, not very effective. Demarcation, this individualized strategies, was used on questions of democracy to send signals of authority and not on policy issues. That was their response. That was their preferred strategy of liberal of everyone. But that sort of right didn't work in a way because kind of, you know, sort of right, this created kind of these opportunities for counter-provocation. So let me just turn to the contemporary data to see sort of right, I mean, kind of if we can kind of try to understand sort of similar dynamics. And again, sort of right, there is a parallel here because kind of, you know, so this is sort of right now this new data that we are looking at sort of right between 2017 and 2021. Okay, sort of right, again, an example of polarized pluralism because we have anti-system parties on both extremes. And again, it is sort of right, the extremists disrupt, the extremists kind of sort of right and kind of engage in the same sort of threat strategies as before. Okay, and the sort of right, the mainstream parties now response. We're not using here, I mean, kind of, you know, this call to order, this strategy, this empirical strategy that I used in Weimar. It is used, but underused. There's only 30 calls to order in this whole parliament, so it's kind of given on an undercount. But I'm going to try to look at sort of right the informal attacks by the sort of right by the politicians of the mainstream parties on extremists, and trying to understand whether there is a strategic logic here. So do sort of right to this sort of informal attack by trying to demarcate yourself from the extremists, but by doing so sort of right undermining kind of the norms of parliament, right? So is this something kind of going on? And again, as I mentioned, sort of right, I mean, kind of I have given you this sort of right this motivation before. There is sort of right a perception that the sort of right that the extremists are after sort of right about violating these norms. These are the sort of like the 6 parties that we will be kind of, you know, that I will be looking at in this kind of, you know, in this sort of talk. So right, so there is a sort of link there, right? The party on the extreme left, also anti-system and the far right, and then sort of right and kind of, you know, centrist party, center left and center right party. And I'm going to sort of try to sort of unpack kind of, you know, their considerations. Is sort of like how are they responding? Again, the data, so again, to how can we study norms, how can we study violations, it comes from this sort of right, this disruption data, right, that sort of right, that, and I'm going to show you in a minute how this is sort of right kind of generated. Okay, sort of right, tumult, verbal remarks, shouts, counter responses, laughter. Even the laughter is, you know, sort of if you read this, and I've been reading this, like even the laughter is kind of sort of right, a strategy, and kind of who laughs when, who claps when. Sometimes you clap, you want to interrupt. Okay, so the AfD claps a lot, not to sort of to stop the debate. Okay, so I'm just saying within these strategies, there's so much to understand and to unpack and sort of right on their strategic use. In terms of just absolute numbers, I mean, of course, this has to be normalized by kind of by the number of politicians, but just in absolute numbers, clearly, okay, sort of right, what I just told you, the AfD is the sort of right, the main kind of, you know, sort of right, the party, I mean, sort of right, in this kind of normalized by the number of deputies. We can see that they are sort of right engaging in these sort of right informal attacks, but then you see sort of right kind of also in the mainstream parties doing, and that's sort of right interesting and sort of right, and who is doing this. Again, this is demarcation, right? This is sort of right, and kind of if I want to understand sort of right, I mean, just to give you an idea on sort of right, I mean, what goes on in this data, what is in this sort of, why I think we need to take seriously these kind of informal attacks. So here is kind of, you know, like an AfD politician. I just didn't have to look hard to pull it out. I've been grateful to Hungarians for a lot of things. Okay, yeah, it's some provocation. I'm not even where they run the risk of being slaughtered by a Muslim, as happened in place. Right? Always bringing it back to the far right, the migrants. Okay. What does the SPD response? Fascist. This is their response, usually. Okay, and you can think, well, this is demarcation, right? We're calling a Nazi, we're calling a fascist, right? I mean, okay, so sometimes when I give this talk in Europe, I'm like, well, that's what you have to do. Okay, right, you have to demarcate. And I agree with this, but I'm just trying to say there is a cost to this. Okay, right, and this demarcation is kind of, right in itself, in a way politically kind of costly. Okay, right, so you are. So I want to make two observations here. One is that right, and I'm going to show you that this is what happens in the data. You usually attack the non-proximate extremist party. So usually this is the SPD and the Greens who called the far right fascist. Now you may say, well, that's somehow obvious. It wasn't necessarily obvious to me when I started. Why right, you would have these kind of, these kind of counter provocations on extreme, but I'm more interested in the feedback on right, and how to think about this. But this is demarcation, right? It is demarcation, you're outside the bounds, but in doing so, you're escalating, right? And this is right, the kind of the erosion that I was discussing today. So basically, okay, right, and kind of, this and many other examples, once you read it, right, you would see that right, and kind of, you can think about it that, well, you have these incentives to attack the non-proximate party. You want to demarcate against, first of all, I mean, right, who are you going to call a fascist? You're going to right, call the non-proximate ones. So the center left, the Greens and the SPD are going to call the AfD, fascists, okay? While, okay, right, and kind of, the center right is going to go after the extreme left and it's going to kind of, right, demarcate against them. And you're going to right, kind of try to enforce the law and so on and so right, and you want to kind of escalate kind of this rhetoric. So one, this is one thing that I will be testing is right, do we see these attacks on the non-extremist parties, which is right, this hypothesis. But then I think, and so since the data is so rich, I mean, we can kind of even dig deeper and think, well, but then it differs, and especially right, and kind of the right, the CDU is interesting, the center-right party is the interesting parties because it's trying to demarcate on both extremes. It has agreements not to make a coalition, neither with the extreme left nor with the extreme right. Right? It's more complex than right, than the kind of the center left and the center right. And as a result, then the incentives within the right, the CDU should be right, and kind of explained by right, by district level kind of conditions. In particular, whether you see a path to victory on the left or on the right, more specifically on kind of how many voters right, and kind of you have. So then what is the distribution of the voters in the district? So this is right, an example in a way. Elisabeth Moschmann from Bremen, okay, she sees a path to victory on the left, right? She has 24% SPD, 11% Greens, 12% Linke. She wants to target these voters. How is she going to by calling the AfD a fascist, right? And that is her path to victory. So she's going to, in a way, pursue this and deviate in a way from the party line, which the party line is, well, we're going to attack. Since she has a left path to victory, she's going to attack them. Whereas, right, we can think of other right, CDU politicians such as Max Staubinger from Bavaria. Okay, his coalition is on the right, right? Okay, he has 44% CSU, okay, 7% FDP in the district, right? He's well, he may want to appeal also to the far right, so he's not going to go after the far right necessarily, right? So he's going to attack the right. So that is the first kind of, so then we should see this divergence. Okay, having to do with the distribution of voters. Okay, so now right, the data, which is, if you know me, this is not what that's my strength. This is right, work with Sean, who is a data scientist, but right, but we have the the Bundestag data gives us really amazing kind of data to right, get at this. Why? Because we have the speech data. Okay, speech data is very rich, and I don't have it here. We're working on this. We can do it by topic. I can tell you what we found. We can do it as right, I mean, who's the agenda. We have all the speech data, but we have all this interruption data, which I just showed you before. Okay, right, and we can kind of, then understand, who is doing the interruption, what's the party, and what is the party that is targeted. And then we can kind of connect this with speaker level data. And we know right, okay, kind of, what district they're coming from, so that we can figuring out whether there's something district specific that explains their behavior. So this is right, how it looks on the web. So the speech ID, politician data. So we know here it's Michel from CDU, from Fulda. Okay, then there's a speech. Okay, and then right, and then that is from Storch, AfD interrupts. Okay, I don't even know what she says here, but this is right, the far right interrupts. Okay, we know also she's shouting. Okay, so we are tagging this. Okay, right, we know her name. Okay, but then right, right, and then there's a kind of counter response, okay, by the CDU, CSU, okay, sort of again, kind of, counterinterrupting. So we do this for every speech. Okay, so right, this is in this case applause, okay, party shouting name. So we can evaluate party by party and candidate by candidate kind of interruptions. Okay, so very preliminary. Okay, and this is where you have better data. So we can just, the first question is the sort of right, the total interruptions, right? So it's a simple negative binomial model, okay, but we want to test sort of right party to party. Okay, so right, is the CDU interrupting the Linke, is the CDU interrupting the far right, and so on and so forth. Okay, and then sort of right, then we can then do it by the district level. And here my main variable is this sort of right, this left coalition margin, which is the left vote share minus the right vote share in the district, right? So that is sort of right. So that's sort of right, just this, the first descriptive. And this is sort of right, just the party level sort of right strategy. Okay, so what do we see here? Now blue is AfD. Okay, sort of right, pink is the Linke, that's sort of right, the far left. So right, so with respect, so I started this by motivating. So right, what we see mainly sort of right, with respect to the SPD or the Greens, right, they attack the far right, really they interrupt, really they call them Nazis. I mean, this is sort of right, their preferred strategy of setting demarcation against the far right. This is sort of right, not surprising, they don't do this against the far left, they do this against the far right. So right, so this is sort of right, that's sort of right in a way that the joint kind of party strategy on the left, on the center left. Now on the center right, it becomes more complicated because they attack both. I mean, but again, as I told you, right, the CDU has this policy of, at least now, we don't know how long it's gonna hold, but at least now it is sort of right demarcation against both extremes. This is in their party manifesto, and this is clearly what they're doing. Okay, so they attack sort of right on both sides. And so then I expect that sort of right, and kind of, their behavior should be sort of right explained by sort of right, by these individual level kind of conditions. And this is sort of right, kind of, one graph that I want to share with you, one result that I want to show, which is sort of right, yes, as the left wing kind of, sort of right, kind of margin to victory kind of increases in the district, you're going to demarcate more against kind of, sort of right, the far right. So, sort of right, so again, to go back to this example of, Elizabeth Mochman versus Max Schrobinger. Okay, sort of right, see, so all the sort of right, center right kind of politicians, CDU politicians who see a path to victory on the left are going to call the sort of right, the far right Nazis. They're going to interrupt them and they're going to sort of right escalate them on this direction. Whereas sort of right, I mean, kind of, the sort of right, the politicians with a path to victory on the right are going to enforce sort of right, I mean, kind of demarcation against kind of the center left. So there's heterogeneity within the strategy. So what is the sort of right, kind of coming back to the broader question, I mean, sort of right, how do extremists break down kind of parliamentary norms, and how sort of right, how can we make sense of this? So I'm trying to think of data to sort of right, to understand how norms break down in parliament. Okay, and again, I started big because kind of it is, to me, I mean, in a way, the lesson of this case is that sort of right, again, we are in a Weimar level situation because we're not using the formal rules as much as we should, or as much as these parties go. They still go to the informal strategies. No, it's all right, the Weimar lessons have not been learned. The Weimar lessons were that sort of right, if we look at the Weimar parliament in kind of a comparative context, I mean, kind of, they underutilize the range of sort of right, formal rules, rule changes that could be used against extremes. So the use of call to orders in Weimar, or the use of sort of right, this kind of calling them Nazis in the current form, is just not an effective strategy of demarcation. This is just a strategy that further escalates. Okay, so sort of in historical perspective, what is striking about the kind of Bundestag is that in the absence of formal institutional procedural changes that combat extremists in today's parliament, and this is the same kind of in France today, that sort of right, okay, that's sort of right, the belief that we're going to sort of be able to deal with this by just enforcing kind of these norms. Okay, there's nothing kind of stronger is necessary, and that is just misleading. Okay, demarcation has its limits. Okay, this is maybe where sort of right, I disagree with most kind of colleagues. Okay, sort of right, who think this is the right thing to do. We have to sort of right, call them Nazis. Okay, this escalates erosion, right? Okay, sort of right. Okay, and I have tried to show you in two ways, and I have tried to show you that sort of right in the Weimar case, sort of right, and kind of once you try to demarcate with these informal norms, then this had led to counter provocation. This has led to this cycle of sort of right, where the mainstream parties are kind of counter provoke, which then puts you sort of right in this dynamic. So what I am trying to sort of to come up sort of kind of conceptually, if there is an alternative to this informal application, I mean, what can you do? Okay, so I mean, maybe kind of, sort of the best strategy is silence. I mean, kind of maybe we cannot respond to provocation by kind of counter-provoking or demarcating because kind of it doesn't seem to work. So I'm going to sort of do some analysis of the text. I don't have that here, but sort of this is where maybe you can provide sort of kind of feedback on how to sort of compare sort of and kind of sort of interactions where demarcation is not used versus interactions and see sort of I mean kind of what happens because we know we have the text, right? So we can do a lot with the data, what sort of what is being said, what is being exchanged, how effective is it, sort of how many kind of et cetera. So but this is I'm not there. I just want to sort of kind of what this is sort of teaching me or teaching us is sort of I mean this is sort of I mean this is completely kind of ineffective and counterproductive. And to study sort of how norms evolve in parliament, we don't only need to look at the extremist parties, we really need to unpack the incentives of these parties. And I'll give you a little bit of an insight here with the sort of the varying partisan and kind of district level incentives sort of playing kind of different roles. So that's it. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Always good when somebody else speaks faster than I do. Why don't we take some questions? We have about half an hour.
Sure. Oh, thanks, Isabella. So this is very interesting and very thought-provoking. And I have a few questions and suggestions, and I'll try to keep them brief because I'm sure there are a lot more reactions. So, I wonder if you can try to estimate trends. And so your theory and your qualitative examples suggest that when you have a counter-provocation, you should have higher frequency of subsequent interruptions. And so it could be estimated by number of speeches, by number of MPs or whatever. But essentially, I think that the next step in this argument would be looking at trends over time and measuring the effects of counter provocations versus call to order or something like that. So that's not exactly a question, but then so I have a question about the audience of the provocations, because you could see it as other parliamentarians and challenges to building consensus and just generally creating stalemate, or it could also be to voters. And so in some cases you suggested that politicians behave differently because they have left-wing voters, say, in their constituency. And so I'm curious how it varies between Weimar and contemporary German parliament, and how do you generally see this two different audiences, other elite parliamentarians versus voters in this project?
Yeah, so thanks so much. So that's what yes, the data is still incomplete, but this is sort of right. And I think there's more than just the number of count, but then the language itself. And that's sort of right. I mean, there's more ways in which one can sort of tease out the effect. All this data is at the speech level, right? So then what happens in this speech once these kind of counter provocations happen? I don't have an answer, but that's where we're going with this. But again, that's sort of many possible. And actually, we are now breaking down by policy areas because it's very, very different when you talk about migration. That's a topic that is owned by the CDU, by the AfD. They try to make everything about there's actually less. I mean, you don't kind of sort of counter-provoke them. You counter-provoke them on democracy, sort of similar, right, to you counter-provoke them on an issue where you have issue ownership, so the economy. Okay, so it's so we are now kind of doing this, but it's just a hard thing to sort of to subcategorize the sort of the type of speeches. But I think that's exactly what I think we need to understand. Now, the audience is, of course, we have done this survey. I mean, so the Weimar audience, this is always reported in the party journals. Okay, now this is hard to do in Weimar, we don't have the voter data, but one can see that sort of that there is an audience, and the audience is always kind of picked up in the SPD, kind of, newspapers on what has happened, the Nazis have done this, okay, this is ours. Okay, so there is a sort of kind of partisan clear audience. Now with the contemporary data, we can of course do more on sort of on kind of, and so we have done, I mean, sort of beginning to do, we're going to do more on sort of on survey experiments, on sort of whether sort of center right and center left voters, reward, how do you think about in terms of competence, in terms of the policy position, resident. We don't have that, so I didn't bring this here, but that would be the way to test. But it is clearly, I mean, all you have to do is open the speeches. I mean, it's very clearly that they are talking to voters. I mean, the AfD politicians, even they do them so short because it goes immediately on these viral clips, and you just have to open TikTok AfD to see that. Right, it is 10 minutes. It is for the this whole provocation. It is sort of that is the audience. Okay, and this is why they're short. They are, this is why they are sort of right. The provocation is escalating. Yeah. So again, thank you for saying this, but I'm trying to tease out more. What I want to do more is sort of right. Does it matter on which domains it happens? Because kind of there seems to be a variation a little bit, right? There seems to be sort of right. I mean, kind of on actually, democracy is hard because kind of, the AfD claims they are the Democrats, right? Kind of everything they are. So that is the most interesting area because kind of here we have a sort of dialogue, competing dialogue on who is the true Democrat. Okay, and that's sort of right, kind of, sort of right. I mean, so that's where you see more, okay, provocation, counter provocation, and how they are using democracy on both sides. That's something that I'm looking into. I'm kind of reading all these speeches, and less sort of right on specific kind of, I don't know, the economic policy. This was a parliament with COVID that made it a little bit kind of complicated. So this is, yes, exactly. So that the test is sort of right. I'm kind of, if you bear with me, maybe at upside I will show these results because we have done, we're doing more on sort of right, showing them these clips, etc., etc. And sort of right on kind of, understanding the sort of right, I mean, the kind of the voters and how the voters kind of, reward or expansion. Yeah, I didn't bring it here. So thanks. Okay, so that's necessary, I guess, for this to be. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you so much. That was very interesting. Just two thoughts. I mean, the first one is it right that you started to look at this starting in 2017, so when the AfD entered parliament, right?
Yeah.
I was just wondering whether you find similar patterns before when the left, I think, was only in parliament, not the AfD, maybe just getting at, to what extent is this strategic? Maybe you find similar patterns without the AfD, and once the AfD entered parliament, this whole thing just intensified, right? But you can see the maybe strategic use of attacks already before that. And the second one is just, I mean, from a comparative perspective, at least until 2017, the German parliament was a pretty boring one, right? No one would interrupt each other, it would be very formal. Compare this to the Westminster system, right? People shout at each other all the time. And I was just wondering whether part of the story is just the normalization of parliamentary business in Germany, basically, getting closer to more, parliaments where people are a little more active in the debates, interrupt each other more often. And what part of it is really about eroding norms and eroding democratic norms specifically, and what part is about just people, liking, to talk to each other a little bit more intensively than before.
Yeah. So the only other metric that I have right now, I mean, to do this is quite time intensive, but is the call to order and the increase. Okay, so that's the metric right, and that's a significant jump. Okay, right. Okay, in this parliament. Okay. But on the other hand, I'm also kind of not 100%. Okay, so this is sort of right. I mean, this is where I want to bring this to the that everything of this is about erosion, right? Okay, some of it is normal parliamentary behavior, right? Okay, and so of course we should have debate, and So the hard thing is actually separating, okay? Right, the hard thing is sort of right, kind of, trying to assess, and I'm just trying to push back a little bit against also say, well, the clapping, that should be sort of, but the clapping, if you see how the AfD claps, I mean, the whole faction claps, they try to clap to stop the discussion. It's a very strategic use, okay? So I don't think we can just go to the categories. This is, okay, so I'm just gonna, now, we're just gonna subset this to shouts and, tumult, and okay, and the rest is kind of parliament as usual. I don't think that's the right strategy. So it's kind of calibrating the measure. And I just think we're gonna just learn about this by sort of actually qualitatively look at these speeches and sort of trying to understand what this behavior is intended to to generate. So I'm a little bit, I am with you that, well, when I looked at this, what is this? But if I wouldn't have done this, and people are a little bit, you're selecting on the kind of, it's just gonna show me the most egregious things. So there's something, this is a continuum, but I'm just trying to say we don't have a language to study parliamentary erosion or to look at the informal politics in parliament and sort of what is sort of right. It's hard, but now with this kind of with this newer data and so on, so I'm just trying to and I think that's the room for qualitative research, actually. I mean, we'll just gather random sample of speeches, and we'll just see okay, so right, what is the meaning of this? Okay, so right now I agree this is overcounting. Okay, things that should be sort of right, this is normal, this Westminster style politics, but I don't want to now undercount and say, like, okay, I'm just gonna look at the violence, okay, because that is to me not understanding kind of, sort of like the uniqueness of this behavior, so how this behaves. So I do think this is only we're gonna make progress on only in kind of qualitatively, so right, unpack, okay, what is going on in interviews and so on and so on, and then how to disaggregate that. So yes, I don't want to say this is just normal politics, and before it was boring, and now it's kind of it's tumultuous and okay, and the fact that sort of in so much noisy data we find these patterns with the district level is just kind of telling you that there's something strategic going on here clearly, and so now so that is sort of right to me the exercise. So I don't want to narrow it before I really understand what this behavior actually means. So it's my qualitative person fighting back and saying, no, okay, please, okay, we're missing, okay, important data. Yeah.
So I was just going to ask, okay, so we have this sharper, nastier debate in the German parliament, but how is this associated with the erosion of democracy, right? What are the parliamentary mechanisms? Is it that there are fewer legislative outcomes, that party coalitions are less stable, that parties are more incoherent, that there are greater defections? What's the connection between sharper, nastier debate and erosion of democracy?
Yeah, I know that, and we can do that. That is not, I think kind of the point is understanding this behavior. Of course, I can kind of correlate this with, this decision on bills, how long it takes, sort of, et cetera, right? All these things that people have studied when they studied parliament, I have no problem. But right now, I'm still trying to kind of characterize this behavior in itself, and just trying to say this is interesting on its own. Now, clearly, kind of, sort of right. The parliament that I just showed you, the parliament, clearly the sort of right, the incessant provocation kind of sort of right. The legislative output was kind of almost zero in the sort of right, 30 to 32 parliaments. So there is sort of right, this connection. Okay, that's sort of right, and kind of, so nothing was being kind of discussed. Everything was being pushed to the committees, and then sort of right, the new kind of parliament came in. So I'm just trying to say that is the standard stuff we have been doing, and I'm fine to go there. But I'm just trying to say there's something analytically interesting here in just answering the previous question, unpacking how this behavior, which is clearly kind of unique to these parliaments, sort of right is sort of right happening, what it kind of means, and what's the strategies used here. And sort of in particular, sort of from this demarcation point, which is the only thing we have, I guess, in the comparative part, about how do you deal with extremists, what do you demarcate? Well, so all the intervention here is just trying to say demarcation is itself a very kind of complicated strategy. Okay, calling them Nazis all the time is, to me, okay, sort of like something that, okay, that this is where I sort of I want to sort of this is where, and I'm going to show you how many, I can kind of count how many times they call them Nazis, etc. So I just want to understand demarcation. I want to understand demarcation as a strategy. It may backfire, it may further escalate, and so on. How this then connects, sure. That's fine, but but the existing electoral parliament never did anything about the informal, right? So I'm just trying to say, once we unpack the informal, then yes, sure. But then, as you see, the informal is very, very kind of complicated, murky. Okay, may lead to unintended kind of consequences. It may sort of and kind of so I'm now in this business of for a while. Okay, yes, I can do the rest, but for a while, I just want to say something about, and that is kind of my first question, which is this is sort of what motivates this project, is how do you talk to a party that promotes all the time? What is an optimal strategy? How do you deal with this? And demarcation, which seems to be what's going on here, is not doing what it should be doing. It's further amplifying. Okay, so that is, I'm keeping it at this level. What happens to the bails, and so on. Of course, once you call them Nazi, there's sort of further escalation and so on and so forth. So yeah, I can do that. There's lots of other people who can kind of, sort of do that. I'm less interested in that. I'm more interested in, okay, in a way, the sort of mapping out the menu of sort of strategies, the menu of informal strategies before I, okay. Yeah, so which, as I try to convince you, there's a lot to unpack here. Sort of right, I'm kind of, conceptually, what is it that they're doing? It's not just, just reaction. There is a strategic kind of, sort of right logic.
Yes, I think it's fascinating to really try to unpack how norms change. So I agree with you. It's very challenging. I think nobody has really documented. And this is very important. And I agree with Anna in saying, okay, eventually we want to see how this translates into, because if this goes into TikTok, I'm sure this is feeding polarization among voters and this language among voters. So obviously, it matters. And just as a suggestion, I don't know if you can do that. Is there a way that you can use all the speech to map it into different type of feelings? So different type of, because I think there is something about polarization that becomes affective and becomes polarizing. It's tied to anger, it's tied to attack. So if you could really, in addition to this, I think, Everhard here is a social psychologist, and she did some work with body-worn cameras with police officers and unpacked the way officers spoke differently with different type of language to African Americans and white Americans here in Auckland. And I don't know exactly how they managed to systematize the feelings and anger and other types of emotions that I think come with polarization. So in a way, it's really provocation. And I think that's, some of what comes out in here, but I wonder if you can also do that. I don't know.
Yes. Yes. I'm noting it. I have not done it. And it is, but just one thing that I can say, sort of like one interesting paper that I have seen recently is Ezekiel from Oxford. So I don't know if you've seen, so he does this with focus groups, right? But he sort of he tries to measure, so like we sort of we don't know. So he tries to measure the depth of the sort of the out group, sort of the dislike. And it's very asymmetric across kind of parties. Okay, and so to me, that is sort of an interesting kind of empirical question here is sort of and that's, we're trying to do this. Like focus groups are really hard in Germany. They're now not in election season, but how much do these kind of voters? So the interesting thing Ezekiel does is he's showing that this is sort of in Argentina, and he shows them sort of fault lines, right? That are the different their depth. And sort of how do you think about, because in Germany too, it's the time now, or it's the, okay, how do you think about the, how deep is it? This deep, and sort of and he shows that for some parties it's very deep, for some it's less deep. So I think that's sort of something, research along those lines, and that's not necessarily survey research, but it's more, sort of yes, qualitative research where he's done the extracting the sort of kind of, the data then that he's processing is the sort of the qualitative response of the sort of of these voters to sort of to these kind of to these questions. And so I do think that's more usable here, and especially since now this is a context where this is also changing and this obviously different than East and West. And so I'm trying to I will try to think of research strategies for the summer. Now going into the field where I'm exposing them. Because I have the speeches now and I've read so many, and it's clearly kind of the language differs. So I will use this. But sort of for this, I don't think a survey-based is just enough, because there's just something, I do think it seems to me that people who do qualitative research are much better at extracting this than, just putting this on a survey and then people will just check whatever, and we don't learn anything. But actually kind of, talking to them and giving to them is so more sort of smaller but qualitative. Again, shows you is where I want to go, because it's not really clear, and I just really recommend this piece, guys. I do think it's just the best piece on effective polarization I have seen in a long time, and it is just purely focus groups and qualitative rather than. Oh, I'm showing you some videos and
Everhard uses the language, and then with a linguist, I have no idea how she does it, but she extracts all So maybe you can.
Yeah, no, he's a data scientist, he's like, this, like my co-author is from Constance, like data scientist, okay, kind of, you know, so yeah, so I will try, but I think what I have seen, I just, and for the Latin Americanists in the room, I think kind of as a paper is just, but this is a comparison also Argentina and and Brazil, and so just the depth of this, you know, fault line.
Yes.
So I do think that is a very good method. Okay.
So we have just a few minutes left, so very quickly, Christoph, super question.
Yeah, I have a question that's related to questions that were asked already. So I think it's great to study the breakdown of norms and so, but I was sort of wondering how important that is in the bigger picture of parliamentary erosion. Maybe it reflects a bit sort of my experience in the country that I grew up in Belgium. But when I think about parliamentary erosion, I think about the fact that and I don't think so much about the rise of populism now. I just think about the fact that Parliament is not a place where things happen in politics in Belgium or in a lot of other countries. Either the agreements are made within the executive, interesting debates are on TV or maybe now on social media and so on. Parliament is a bit boring. So how important in that picture of parliamentary erosion is the breakdown of norms then?
Yeah, but I mean, we subset this by bills that come from the government, because the German sort of has this, so if it's initiated by the government, there's no difference. So, and I do think that there's a significant kind of, you know, legislative output here. I mean, I don't want to undercount kind of, you know, I mean, so there's sort of COVID period, you know, surrounding the European migration crisis. I mean, how can you say that there's just so much that these kind of parliaments have to address, like sort of right in this period. So I didn't see a difference. It's kind of as in the paper on sort of right on you know, who initiates the bill, by bill type and by the sort of right, by the initiation. So okay, and I do think that, I mean, there's something nice about the parliament. Okay, we have suddenly from n equals 1, we have 500 politicians who interact with each other, sort of right, and this is measured. Okay, on camera and in the kind of speeches. So I do think kind of we have sort of appreciated this sort of right, this wealth of data, and as you can see, you can unpack sort of right individual. So I just want to push back a little bit. Okay, okay, I can do it by bill importance, okay, and see if the sort of findings are robust and bill type and so on. I do think kind of, I mean, you don't want to say this. There's so much sort of right. I mean, even kind of in this, you know, fractured parliament, there was a lot of sort of right and kind of, you know, the sort of all the COVID legislation that passed through this. I mean, it's a major increase in the role of the state in the economy, right? Okay, so I don't know. Okay, I mean that's yeah. I think that's all
To the question of sentiment analysis, if you can do that, some of that. One thing that you really probably want to know is whether escalation shifts you into a different space of speech, different types of words, or for example, the kind of thing some people have done here with the migration and dehumanization. So the moment when you cross this threshold that you're talking about migrants as animals rather than as persons, these kind of things are the things that would be like I think the smoking gun about the escalation, because otherwise the escalation, I mean, the counter and counter, how do you know? How many times do you have to counter each other?
Well, we can measure by, I know, but that is the question here. We have the account data that I showed you is by speech, and there's 87. So the right the count is there's 8 speeches where there's 87 types of these exchanges. So clearly they are different. Well, I expect, I don't know. Just, but I agree there's something. I know I need to show you more, and that would be just by subsetting in the speeches and doing the languages on and then testing this experiment. So that's, I'm aware of this.
I wonder, particularly if there's like a qualitative leap of something that was forbidden. Trump did this in the US. I mean, it was forbidden to use some phrases and some words in the politics of the country, and suddenly it's not anymore.
I know, and that's again why this data is quite amazing, because it allows you to see these shifts, and these shifts sort of differ across policy areas. But then it's also interesting that the mainstream parties then are part of it, because they actually, some of them say, I mean, the ones who want to cater to the far right, they use this, right? So there's all this kind of going on that, you know, that I think we need to understand. So I'm just trying to say this escalation that already is not just the monopoly of the far right. At this point, it has mainstream, and so on. Okay, and that's sort of right. I think what I want to understand. Okay, so yeah. Thank you. I will get back to you on references. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.